If you will, open your Bibles up to 1 Samuel. We have started a new series that is going to be so long that when Aragon sent me the notes and the timeline and stuff, he just wrote in the message that I'm not going to put any definitive time on this because it's going to take a while or whatever, you know. So when the pastor is honest enough to say it's going to be a while, it's going to go a while. Okay, so but in this series, what we're doing is we're looking at various Old Testament characters and seeing what we can glean from their lives and from God's work in their life. And so, who remembers who we've talked about so far? Just shout one out, one character. Close. Try again. Who's that?
Eli.
Eli? Yeah, we talked a little bit about Eli. Hannah, Samuel, and today we're going to be looking at Saul. Now, before we get to Saul, let me just mention kind of where we're at in Israel's history. Israel at this point has been in the Promised Land for some time. Remember, they were delivered from Egypt, wandered through the wilderness, and finally made it to the Promised Land, got to the Promised Land, got into the Promised Land, was supposed to basically eradicate everybody that was there, failed to do that, and now here we find ourselves in Israel in the Promised Land with the Israelites, and under various leaders that pop up from time to time, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in the first few chapters of Samuel, what Aragon's walked us through so far, we saw that they were taken captive, or at least got in a battle, I should say, with the Philistines, lost, tried to win, tried to use God as some kind of relic, use the Ark of the Covenant as some kind of relic. You guys remember all that? Anybody remember that? Yeah. That's right. And then Israel just hasn't learned their lesson as far as fearing the Lord, really. And last week, Aragon talked about Samuel, who was a very significant figure. And does anybody remember what Aragon highlighted as Samuel's kind of key characteristic, or what his ministry was? Samuel was a man who turned
Israel back to God.
That's right. He turned people to the Lord. He was a man that turned people to the Lord. And he did that in various ways at various times. And so, but at the end of chapter 7, it says that Samuel continued as Israel's leader all the days of his life. From year to year, he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also held court for Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord. So you get this sense that I'm trying not to get ahead of myself, but it's hard. But so if I say some of this stuff later in the sermon, then just count yourself blessed. If you missed it now, you get it later. So Samuel is he's the key leader. He's brought Israel to peace with the Philistines, which is who they were having a problem with at the time. And so Israel is in this time of relative peace, and then they find themselves starting to be threatened by another group of people. And it is at this time that they come to Samuel in light of his sons, who are not as godly as he is, and they tell him that they would like a king. And the first king in Israel, at least according to popular notions, is Saul. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And so I want to talk about Saul as God's anointed. So let's first of all look at, we're going to be spanning like 4 chapters. That's why we're not going to stand and read today, because I wouldn't do that to you. I'm not going to read all 4 chapters while you're standing. But so let's pick this story up in can you read that? Okay, all right. So let's pick the story up in chapter 8. So if you look at chapter 8, verse 1 with me, it says, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leader. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It's not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." First of all, if you're familiar with the story at all, you'll remember that repeatedly this request is referred to as a wicked request or an evil request. That this is not a good thing that they're requesting a king. But as you also may know, it was not it's not that having a monarchy was evil or wicked. It's not that that was an unacceptable form of government. And the reason I say that is because, as I put in the PowerPoint, in Genesis 17:6, this is at the beginning of the very first patriarch of Israel. This is Abraham. When God was speaking to Abraham, he told Abraham, "I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you." Again, to Abraham's grandson, Jacob, in Genesis 35:11, he says, "And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants." This was generations before this, what we're reading here. And God had told them, kings are going to come from you. This was always going to happen. It's not as though this was unacceptable in and of itself. So then what was the issue? Oh, I guess I have my PowerPoint right here. I don't want to preach half my sermon with my back turned towards you. First of all, Israel is rejecting God's provisions through this request. What do I mean by that? I mean that Israel has existed as a nation for plenty of time before this day, with no king. How? The Lord was their king. Their God was the God who brought them out of Egypt, decimating the Egyptians. Remember the story? All the plagues? The Egyptians were pleading with the Israelites to leave because they were so decimated. That happened with no king to fight for Israel. Once they got away from Egypt, as you remember how the story goes, they find themselves at the brink of the Red Sea, and they just don't know what to do. Who came through? God came through. When they got to the other side, and they sang the song, and they worshipped and all that, now they're hungry and thirsty, and they just wish they could go back to getting the food that they had. Sure, they were slaves in Egypt, but they wish they could go back. Who came through? The Lord came through and fed them and gave them water, whether it was from a rock or making bitter water sweet, numerous different times. When the Amalekites came chasing hard on their heels while they were in the wilderness, while they were tired, we'll get into that more next week, they were taking advantage of the weakness of the Israelites as they were fleeing Egypt. God came through and delivered them from the Amalekites. Let me read this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 7. This is Moses speaking to the Israelites. He said, "The Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He has watched over your journey through this vast wilderness. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked anything." Now that was spoken again by Moses to the Israelites. Who was Moses? Moses was a guy who God selected and raised up in order to lead the Israelites out of Egypt when they were in bondage. Let me just read a few more examples, because the point I'm trying to make here is that God had provided whatever leadership was necessary in any case for the Israelites before this time here. When they were coming into the promised land, Jericho, you guys remember the story of Jericho? That was the miraculous way by which God delivered Jericho into the Israelites' hands. And that was at the leadership of Joshua, chosen by God. Other battles, the king of Heshbon was given to them. The king of Bashan was overran by the Israelites at the hand of God. Then you have the time of the judges. So let me just read a few of these. This is the only kind of weird one. It's sort of hard to say. Aram Naharaim, okay? After being subject for 80 years. This was the king of a foreign nation that the Israelites were subject to for 80 years. When they had cried out, the Lord raised up a man named Othniel in order to deliver them from Aram Naharaim's oppression. After that, it was Eglon. Eglon was another king of another foreign nation that had oppressed Israel severely. They were under his oppression for 18 years, and then God raised up Ehud to deliver them. I'm just going through examples throughout Judges. If you go through the book of Judges, you'll find these examples. And the cycle in Judges is that the Israelites would be unfaithful to the Lord, start worshiping idols, and break the covenant that they had with God. And then God would hand them over to their enemies. And then when basically the Israelites would finally come to the point of humility and cry out to the Lord would raise somebody up to deliver them. So we have the first king, we have Eglon, then you have Sisera. Sisera for 20 years was a king who had his army oppressing the Israelites, and then God raised up Deborah. Then you had the Midianites for 7 years, and then God raised up Gideon. Then you had the Philistines and the Ammonites for 18 years. God raised up Jephthah. The Philistines for 40 years. God raised up Samson. You see a pattern or a cycle? Like, is it making sense that God always provided for somebody to deliver the Israelites if the Israelites would cry out to him and call out to him? And lastly, and most relevantly to these people in this situation, would be Samuel. There was a battle that Samuel had led them out of and basically operated as a judge in order to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. So in chapter 7, verse 10 and 11, it says this, if you want to look at it with me. While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. This is chapter 7, verse 10. But that day the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. The men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them along the way to a point below Beth-kar. Once again, the Lord fought the battle for the Israelites. Sure, through Samuel, but it says that the Lord thundered in order to rout the Philistines, in order to cause a confusion or commotion so that they couldn't be overtaken by the Philistines. The Lord came through. Verse 12 says, Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen. He named it Ebenezer, saying, Thus far, the Lord has helped us. And in light of all the examples I've just given, we see that that's speaking, he's speaking specifically of that instance, but we can see that that's relevant to the history of Israel. The Lord has helped us. Thus far, the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued and they stopped invading Israel's territory. Throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. Throughout the whole lifetime of Samuel. The towns from Ekron to Gath that the Philistines had captured from Israel were restored to Israel, and Israel delivered the neighboring territory from the hands of the Philistines, and there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. I make a point out of this because obviously it arises from the text, but I want you to recognize that God has worked in our life also. God works on behalf of his people. One of the reasons why I picked Psalm 103 for Aragon to read earlier is because there's reminders in there of how the Lord treats his people and how the Lord has been faithful to his people, how he's a God who forgives his people. Remember the Lord and forget not his benefits. Don't forget those things. By the end of this sermon, we're going to see where Samuel tells the Israelites to consider what the Lord has done for them. This is so important to remember the history of God's faithfulness, the resume that God has of always coming through for his people. God had always done that for them, and he continues to work on behalf of his people. That's why in Romans it's so powerful to hear that God is working all things together for the good of his people. I'm paraphrasing that last portion, but you know the text. It's of his people, those who are called according to his purpose. His purple purpose. Slow down, Michael. Slow down. So the Israelites, in asking for a king, they're rejecting the provision of God. They're just disregarding this long history they have of God always raising up judges in order to deliver them whenever they needed that help. We've already been through that. In 8, 19, and 20, or 19 through 20, I should say, we're going to see that they are also rejecting the call that God has on his people, on the nation. The nation of Israel was called to be a holy nation. Now, you probably heard me say this before, but holy does not just mean completely perfect. Holy means set apart. It's a word that is speaking of the differentiation. Now, to be perfect is to be morally set apart, so that works. But it's not just sinlessness. That's not what holiness. That's not the extent of what holy means. It's just to be sinless. And sometimes I make that clear because sometimes I think we use the word holy when we're thinking of, like the holiness movement where we wouldn't. How does it go? They wouldn't. Somebody help me out. They wouldn't dance or chew or hang out with girls to do or whatever, something like that. That's the most narrow, sort of most rigid and really truncated idea of holiness. Holy is to be set apart. The nation of Israel was to be set apart as a light among the nations. This was supposed to be like a beacon of light of how God works, how God interacts and relates with his people amongst these other nations. Exodus 19:6 says this: "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant," remember Exodus 19, so where are we at? Is this after the kingdom has been established in Israel? No, it's not. It's in Exodus. This is right after they have been delivered from Egypt, right? This is right at the beginning of their trek through the wilderness. "If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine," for anybody who would say, well, isn't everything God? Well, yeah, everything's God's, but I mean, we don't just flatten everything in Scripture and say, God, everything, and he does everything, and that's not the way it works. There's a history here. "Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." This is God conferring on Israel a national identity from day one. You're to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's what I'm emphasizing here, a holy nation. You see this in the book of Leviticus. Everybody, it's March 1st tomorrow, so any yearly Bible has got you in Leviticus probably now or right past it. Either you've quit or you've just made it through Leviticus and you're like, I'm really going to do it this time. So Leviticus is a book that anytime you read a commentary and it gives you an overview, they say that it's about holiness. Now that's so important when you understand the national identity of Israel. So, for example, in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 22 to 24, it says this. Hold on. First of all, in Leviticus 20, there's command after command after command of how to be sexually pure. And it details out all these different examples of what not to do and what not to do and what not to do, who not to lay with, and so on. And then also there's a command in there about not cursing your mother or father, or else you'll be stoned. So there's all these commands, and at the end of it says this: "Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. You must not live according to the customs of the nations that I'm going to drive out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. But I said to you, you will possess the land. I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations." At least one part of God's sexual ethic for the nation of Israel was to differentiate them from the nations around them. And the reason why I say, because that has a component of sin, obviously, that, it's in the Ten Commandments that you're not supposed to commit adultery. We know that extends more broadly, that it's about fidelity to one wife or one spouse, and that's it. But as I mentioned earlier, holiness is not just about being sinless. And so in the nation of Israel, even the dietary laws, which isn't such a clear moral issue, it's not that, certain animals they're predators, therefore they're sinful, so if you eat them, then you're partaking in the sin. It's not something weird like that, but it was a way of differentiating themselves from other nations around them. So, for example, again, in Leviticus 20, this is just the next couple of verses, verse 25 and 26, it says, "You must therefore," this is going to answer a question for some of you, because some of you wonder, why the heck, why couldn't you eat fish or I love shrimp. What was the big deal about that? Listen. "You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, and between unclean and clean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground. Those that I have set apart is unclean for you. You are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own." There were some oddities about Israel that identified them as different than the nations around them. Now, hopefully, if you've been in church more than a week or two, you can hear the New Testament echoes of that. Romans 12, something about be conformed, transformed. How does that go? "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." That same non-conformity, that same call to holiness is also on his people today. And who is his people? All those who are partaking of the new covenant blood. Remember the Lord's Supper where he says that we're in, this is the blood of the covenant? We are still a covenant people. God is still a covenant God that works with his people and has set his people apart. 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter, referring to Christians, quotes Leviticus, where I just read. "Be holy as I am holy." It's the same differentiating call for us to be holy. But Israel, knowing better than God, because we all know better than God, of course, they're rejecting God's call by saying, we want a king like all the other nations. They weren't called to be like all the other nations. What other nation can have an army of people that are basically just farmers? They're not trained soldiers, and they're not just warrior people, but they're just pretty much common folk. But they're being threatened, and so they get a few thousand people together, and they say, "Doggone it, we're gonna go down swinging." And then their God tells them, "You know what? That's way too many. Why don't you whittle it down to 300?" And then then defeats everybody. That's a nation not like the other nations. God was their king, but Israel was rejecting God's provisions by requesting a king because they are just running roughshod over their whole history of God delivering them. And secondly, and what I'm getting at here, is that they're rejecting God's call to be holy, to be different, to be without a king, at least in this point in their history. They said, no, we want to be just like the other nations. Let me read the passage. So this is chapter 8, verses 19 and 20. It says, "The people refused to listen to Samuel." This is because Samuel had warned them of the kind of oppression that will come underneath the king. "But the people refused to listen to Samuel. 'No,' they said, 'we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles.'" That's what we want, is to be just like the other nations. I can't tell you how many times, an hour, a week, a day, that we are tempted to do something in order to fit in rather than to be faithful to the Lord. Now listen, there are some things that we can do in order to fit in that are neutral. I'm not saying that we're just weird for the sake of being weird. And I'd be thrilled if that's the case, because I'm good at that. You can ask my family. I'll weird everybody out. But it's not just about bumper stickers and wearing your shirt backwards and it's not about that. It's about being faithful to the Lord and recognizing that now when you walk in a room and everybody was cussing, all of a sudden they're not going to cuss because, oh no, he's different. You're a light in a dark place. This is what God's people have always been called to be. We are following a different moral standard. We're honest when nobody's looking. And so even though you could have pushed a different time on the time clock and went home 15 minutes early, no, we're more honest than that. And while so-and-so looks at us and says, What's the big deal? I mean, you're making me look bad. No, we're not. I mean, well, maybe we are, but that's not the point. The point is I'm doing what the Lord's calling me to do, and that's to be holy because he is holy, and that's going to naturally, fundamentally differentiate me and you, his covenant people, from the rest of the world. That's what Israel was called to be, though. But Israel is spurning that call here by requesting a king. So we've dealt with the wicked request. I'll give you a chance to read that. I already told you everything in there. But now I want to shift, and I want to highlight another point that I think the author in 1 Samuel here is getting at, because of the repetitiveness of it. And that is that Saul is God's chosen king. Saul is God's chosen king. Look at chapter 9, verse 15. We're going to see 4 kind of different ways that it's reiterated that this is the man that God chose to be the king. Chapter 9, verse 15 to 18 says, "Now the day before Saul came," I'm sorry, I got to fill you in. Since we're not, I got to fill you in. So Saul is introduced as the son of a man named Kish. Kish is a distinguished man. There's various different translations. One translation says he's a prominent man. One says that he's a wealthy man. And this is in chapter 9, verse 1. You can read your translation and see what it says. Mine in the NIV says he was a man of standing. So Saul's dad was somebody of notoriety. And so Saul comes from that. And his dad tells him, you need to go and fetch my donkeys. They ran away. I need you to go get them. Saul takes his servant with him and goes out for this trek. And he's on this adventure, wandering through a wilderness, basically. I mean, he's going all throughout the country land and looking for these donkeys. Now, they've been gone so long that Saul suggests, listen, we should probably head back because, I mean, at this point, my dad's probably worried more about us than he is about the donkeys. So let's just head back. But the servant says, wait. I know where we're at here. We're pretty close to this town where there's a man of God. Why don't we just go and inquire of him and see what he says? And so they're getting close to this town when we pick it up here in verse 15. So verse 15 says, "Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed that Saul was coming to Samuel." Verse 16, "About this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me." When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" And then it goes on from there. The point I want to highlight here is that while Saul just thinks he's farm fetching, he's going looking for donkeys, little did he know, actually completely oblivious was he, that God had already predetermined that he was actually going to be found by Samuel and anointed king. This just highlights that truth that we find ourselves coming back to again and again and again, that God is sovereign over all things, even things that we're not aware of. And like I mentioned earlier, that passage in Romans about God working all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. There's the people that he's working on behalf of, and he's even orchestrating things at all times, even when we're not aware. There is always more going on than what we're aware of. Whether it's the day before Saul shows up here, Saul wasn't even intending on going to this town. Remember, it was totally accidental. They just happened to be there, and the servant happened to suggest that why don't we, and the servant, think of how many things have to come together to make this story work. The servant had to be aware of that area and know that there was a prophet there. Samuel had to be there at the time, because you're going to read as you go on that Samuel was just showing up to the town so that he can go and offer sacrifice. So many things that come together, but God had a plan in all of that. And so, in a time when things look as chaotic as they do, even in our world, this is just another reminder of the fact that God is working things toward an end. He's working means toward an end at all times. But the point I'm trying to highlight is that this was the man. Saul is the man that God singled out. And I'm going to make a big to-do about this for the next three. I'm going to give these next three examples because it's clear in the story. But also, if you know your Bible, you know where Saul ends up. And it's remarkable to realize that God made abundantly clear that this was his man that he chose for this job. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 9. This is another kind of reiteration of the fact that this was God's chosen. Then Samuel took a flask of olive oil. This is after they had Saul spent the night there with Samuel. They've had a meal. They've left. And now Samuel tells Saul to let his servant go on. And now it's just Samuel and Saul talking. Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, "Has not the Lord anointed you ruler of his inheritance? When you leave me today, you will meet two men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin." There's sign number one. He says, when you leave here, you're going to meet two men at a specific place on the border of Benjamin. Then they're going to say a specific thing to you. They will say to you, the donkeys you set out to look for have been found. And now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about you. He's asking, what shall I do about my son? That's a very, very specific prophecy. I came from a church where words of prophecy were spoken, words get spoken over you and all that. And I've been encouraged by them. I've been uplifted. I've even, maybe taken some direction. But I can't think of it. I can think of one time. This isn't to cast shade on that whole entire movement as a whole. That's not the point I'm getting at. But I can only think of, I can't think of a time where I had a prophetic word as specific as, you're going to leave here, you're going to see two people, they're going to meet you at a certain spot, they're going to tell you a certain thing. I mean, that's really super specific. Then a second sign, verse 3. Then you will go on from there until you reach the great tree of Tabor. 3 men going up to worship, again, specific, but 3 men, not 4, not 2, 3 men will meet you there. 3 men going up to worship God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, and another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. Again, just pay attention to how specific that is. This is remarkable. And then a third sign, verse 5. After that, you will go to Gibeah of God, where there is a Philistine outpost. As you approach the town, you will meet a procession of prophets coming down from the high place with lyres, timbrels, pipes, and harps being played before them, and they will be prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you. I take the being changed to a different person, not that he was 4 feet, then he's going to be 6 feet all of a sudden, not that he was light skinned, then he's going to turn dark skinned, not something like that, but that the Spirit of the Lord is going to come upon him in order to enable him and empower him to become a king, in order to carry out those duties. Verse 8, go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do. That'll be relevant specifically next week. But then verse 9, as Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart, and all these signs were fulfilled that day. Again, that's not a reference to regeneration. It's not that God was telling through Samuel, you're anointed to be a king, and all this talk about king, and then, all of a sudden, you're a believer now. I don't think that's what that's getting at. I think it's getting at the fact that Saul is being empowered, equipped supernaturally in order to hold the office of kingship. But the point here is that in no uncertain terms, to Samuel, who is the prophet of the day. Remember, Samuel is a prophet in a time when earlier in 1 Samuel it said that this was a time when the word of the Lord was rare. There was not a prophet on every block. Samuel is the man, capital P prophet at the time. God makes clear to Samuel, this is the man who's going to be my king. God, secondly, makes clear to Saul now that he truly is the one that's chosen. So now it's clear to Saul that this is divinely from God, because there's 3 different signs, and it says in verse 9, Saul turned to leave, and all these signs were fulfilled that day. So it's abundantly clear to Saul. Can't believe it. I thought I was just looking for donkeys, but I guess I'm a king now. Thirdly, though, third reiteration of how we know that this is really God's man. Chapter 10, verse 24. Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There's no one like him among all the people." Then the people shouted, "Long live the king!" Lost my spot. So in 10:24, so this is where Samuel now goes and announces Saul to the people. Now this is the first knowledge that they have of who their king's going to be. And when Samuel announces it to them, he announces it as God's anointed, not Samuel's appointed, not democratically elected, not self-appointed, God appointed. This is the way that God chose to establish his king, was to just directly choose him, make it clear to a prophet, and then confirm that through the signs through Saul, or signs to Saul. So we have Samuel announcing here that this is God's man. And then lastly, you have in 11, verses 12 through 15, because there were a few people that said, well, how can this guy be our king? There's always a few people that whenever you're chosen for something, there's some haters or people that just don't agree. Well, there were some people like that with Saul. It says at the end of chapter 10, Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. But some scoundrels, okay, so that was the Hebrew word for haters, I guess, scoundrels. But some scoundrels said, "How can this fellow save us?" They despised him and brought him no gifts, but Saul kept silent. Well, those people were dealt with later, because Saul, as some Israelites in Jabesh Gilead, which is just an Israelite town, were being besieged, the ultimatum from the people besieging them was 7 days, or they said that basically surrender or it's over. And the people in Jabesh Gilead said, "Give us 7 days, and then we'll surrender if nobody defends us." And so they go to Saul, and this is at the end of chapter 11. They go to Saul, and Saul rallies a bunch of, he cuts up some oxen and says, "This is what it's going to be like for anybody who doesn't come to the aid of these Israelites." So he basically calls an army together, and they go and defend the town, and they're victorious. And at the end of that episode, in chapter 11, verse 12, the people then said to Samuel, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Turn these men over to us so that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "No one will be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. So lastly, we have a religious celebration celebrating the fact that this king is God's anointed. So, it was a wicked request fulfilled by God. I put that way to sort of spark your interest. Seriously? God just answered a wicked request? This is what I really want to get to, and I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes on this slide, I guess. The covenant God, firm but patient. In chapter 12, we have Samuel's farewell speech. And in his speech, he's speaking with the voice of a prophet, man. He's calling them out for their wicked request, but he has some words of consolation also. First of all, in verse 7, I'll start in verse 6, but I highlighted one phrase there. In verse 6 it says, "Then Samuel said to the people, 'It is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your ancestors up out of Egypt. Now then, stand here, because I am going to confront you with evidence before the Lord as to all the righteous acts performed by the Lord for you and your ancestors. He goes on and he just explains what I had explained earlier about the various different ways that God came through for his people earlier. But I want you to hear Samuel here as, you know, playing the role of an attorney and accusing the Israelites for what they're guilty of. He's putting his finger in their chest and showing them how it was utterly unthinkable to distrust God after he's brought them to where they're literally standing at the moment. I don't know what it is, just our sin nature, our arrogance, our pride, or whatever it is, that wants to constantly close our eyes to what God has done, and at best explain it away if we have to acknowledge it. Explain it away as some coincidence or some brilliance on your own part, instead of give him the praise that he's due. These Israelites sure had a problem with that. Seemed like by the time they were finishing their last bite of manna, they were whining about, well, I need something to wash it down with. It's always something more. Just like kids. It's never thank you. It's how about how about just thank you? Excuse me? Not always, that's right. I mean, after we give you what you want, you're busy with that for a second. So that's true. Israelites were like that also. But anyway, Samuel here is confronting them with just that fact. So he goes on. After Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord. This is verse 8. He's just doing here what I was doing earlier, but I'm just going to read it. Jacob entered Egypt. They cried to the Lord for help, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your ancestors out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, so he sold them into the hand of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hands of the Philistines and the king of Moab, who fought against them. And this is just shorthand for more and more examples he could give of how God just handed them over and handed them over and handed them over, because they just persistently were accusing him that he wasn't coming through for them. But verse 11, then the Lord sent Jerubbaal, he sent Barak, he sent Jephthah and Samuel, and he delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around you, so that you lived in safety. It's such a testament to the ingratitude of man that Samuel can use the faithfulness of the Lord and recount those stories and call that an accusation to them. Because, like I just keep saying, the people just couldn't recognize God's goodness. Then, skip down to verse 16. As Samuel continues to be firm with them, he says, now then stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? I will call on the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. Now he's going to bring a sign. God's going to send a sign to confirm all the words of this prophet that, you know, all you Israelites, you know, because it said earlier in 1 Samuel, that none of his words have failed. So he's got a reputation as a solid prophet. But lest you think that now he's accusing you, that maybe he's off his rocker, he's a little bit old, maybe it's something setting in, and no. A sign is going to confirm that you are guilty of what Samuel is bringing before you, of spurning God's goodness. And so that's exactly what happens. It's the time of year when there would rarely be any rain or flooding. And when there was, it would be torrential. But it's not that this thing just happened. It was an unlikely thing that happened. It was that it happened on command. That's the miraculous part about it. Then Samuel called on the Lord, and that same day, verse 18, and that same day the Lord sent thunder and rain. So all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. Another verse in here that highlights the firmness of God, or the firmness of, as Samuel, his prophet, is speaking to them, is in verse 19. Because after all this happened, the people all said to Samuel, "Pray to the Lord your God for your servants so that we won't die. For we have added to all of our other sins the evil of asking for a king." They're just undone. And bless God for the times when, as painful as correction can be, to be confronted with evidence is what it said earlier. As painful as that can be, it's so liberating and freeing when it does its work to bring a person or a group of people to the point of saying, we have done it. You're just filleted, you're just undone, and the word has done its work at scoping out every nook and cranny that you thought you were hiding in. They say, we have done it. We have added to all of our other sins the evil of asking for a king. But although the Lord can be firm and is firm with his people, his loving kindness endures forever. So chapter 12, verse 20, the next verse. Samuel replies, right after they admit this, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. You've done all this evil, yet don't turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart." I think I'm just gonna read the other two examples I have of the tenderness here, and then I'll make my point. So verse 20 says, "Do not be afraid," Samuel replied. "You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they are useless." Verse 22, "For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right." Verse 24, "But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he's done for you." I'm going to leave it there, and then I'm going to end on 25 in a second. I just want to highlight the fact that although the Israelites are just being as faithless as ever, God is being as good as ever. That even though they're about to feel the pain of their own bad decision, because they are going to end up being oppressed by Saul, they are going to end up being handed over to their enemies at times, they are going to feel even further later, they're going to feel the chaos that happens when a dynasty breaks down and when there's family conflict between the father and the son, and not a smooth transition of power. They're gonna feel the consequences of this bad decision. But the comfort is that God is presiding over all of that. And it reminds me of a story. So when David had got called out for his sin, remember, David is going to be the king after Saul. When David got called out for one of his sins, the prophet came to him and confronted him about it. And this is what the prophet told him. This is 1 Chronicles 7. This is what the Lord says. "Make a choice for yourself, either 3 years of famine or 3 months of reversals, as you are swept away by your enemies, while the sword of your enemies overtake you." See, this is the prophet saying there's a choice of 3 options of what the judgment could be for your sin, David. This is in 1 Chronicles 7, again, if you want to write that down and read it later. Either 3 years of famine. Imagine what a famine's like. Imagine what a famine's like. Having no food. Aragon did a really good job a few weeks ago of just highlighting the centrality of food and how for so long it was not easy to come by. It's not as easy as it is today. So it's really hard for us to imagine a famine, but just imagine basically starving to death, literally starving to death. So you could have 3 years of a famine, or 3 months of reversals, basically your enemies. It says, "As you are swept away by your enemies, while the sword of your enemies overtake you." So you're just left at the mercy or lack thereof of all of your enemies. And they're going to come in and wipe out whoever. They're going to rape whoever. They're going to kidnap whoever. They're going to subject whoever. 3 years of that. Or 3 days with the sword of the Lord, meaning a direct judgment from God, consisting of pestilence infecting the land, with the angel of the Lord wreaking destruction from border to border throughout all of Israel. That doesn't sound too pleasant either. Decide right now what I am to answer to the one who sent me. Here's David's reply. He replied to Gad, "This is a very bad choice for me to make. Let me now please fall into the hand of the Lord, because his mercy is very great. But may I never fall into human hands." In that instance, I mean, this story came to mind when I was, preparing for the sermon, and I had to read it because it highlights again the fact that I would much rather be under the loving discipline of the Lord and know that whatever pain is in my life, even if it's self-inflicted and I'm reaping my own bad consequences of my own choices, to know that I'm in the people of God with the Lord who is a Father over me or over you, presiding over that, and that is what the comfort is. No matter what the pain comes, no matter what lessons I have to learn, and how, I might take a lot because I can be hard-headed, knowing that it's God presiding over that discipline is what the comfort is. And so I think that's what's illustrated in this story. That while the people of God are requesting their own destruction, I mean, honestly, God hands them over to that, but he's managing this whole thing. He actually selected the man himself who's gonna end up being just a total tyrant and madman, especially when he's chasing David and all that. But God selected this man. God's carrying this out on the people of God. And now it's exactly what the Israelites wanted, but God is using this for their ultimate good. And we already know that in the long run, there would be a king that would come that would be the true king. And so even in the request of a king, they're requesting something way better than they ever thought that they would receive. And that is Jesus is king in the far future. So just in summary, God is intimately involved in the affairs of his people, even when we're most oblivious, like Saul wandering looking for donkeys. God is working. One of the things that we have to get past, especially in a church like this that's not a charismatic church, and charismatic churches, they just are emphasizing the fact that God's right here, right now. But usually when they say that, okay, I'm gonna rib them a second, just real quick. When they say that, what they mean is God is here right after the third song when we start playing the music without the words and the lights are low. That's when God's here. But anyway, but what I'm getting at is they have an awareness of God working today. And in a church like this, sometimes we sort of forget that God is actually working in your specific life. He's arranging things around your life and around your family and things that we don't even recognize. He's working still the way that he worked with Saul, where he's talking to Samuel the day before, and Saul happens to be. That kind of stuff is happening, and we can give God glory when we see those things manifest. Secondly, God is long-suffering with his people. That was really the crux of this whole message, just what I wanted to get at. That God is a long-suffering, patient God. He's a God who definitely brings judgment, but he's a God who's slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness. And he has to be for us to be his people, right? I mean, honestly. He is so good. Don't ever turn your back on the Lord out of fear that he's some sort of tyrant, that you've sinned too many times, that you did something too wrong. Jesus said in John 3 that the judgment has come, and the judgment is this, that the light has come into the world, but men love darkness rather than light. The light didn't do nothing wrong. It's that the men were convinced and consumed and committed to their darkness so much that they would not come to the light. Come to the light. And lastly, consider what great things he's done for you. Don't ever forget about the goodnesses that he's shown us. Don't get so introspective, meaning looking at your own self and your own performances, that you just convince yourself that God's gave up on you just because you've given up on you. That's not the way that it works. Consider all the things that he's done for you and for your family and throughout the history of redemption as we read the scriptures and see that he's actively working. I mean, he's pursuing his people. He's guarding his people. He's protecting his people. He's providing his people. He's bringing his people home. He goes and prepares a place for us, is what Jesus said about his people. He's in the last book of the Bible. We're in Revelation. Where is Jesus found? He's the one among the what? The lampstands. What did the lampstands represent? The churches, his people. Jesus is among his people. The resurrected Jesus, even after. He's among his people. He's with us. That's what he's just among us and he's working among us and he's and we need to thank him for that and not forget all he's done for us. So let's close in prayer. Thank you for, Lord God, for just for being good to us. And even when we don't recognize your patience toward us. And we just live like atheists by not praying to you in our times of need, by not praising you and glorifying you in all the blessings that we receive, and not speaking about you to other people as if you're not worthy of being spoken of. Lord, even in those times, you are faithful to us and continuing to work in us. I pray that if there's anyone in here today that has functionally just turn their back on you or is tempted to do so for whatever reason, that you would use this message in order to turn them back to you and to remind them that you are a God who embraces those who humbly submit to him. Help us, Lord, to see you in the light of who you truly are, not as a tyrannical king like Saul will be and like all human kings will be, but a just judge, a holy God, not like any other God, so-called God, and a loving Father, one who would even send his Son to redeem his people. You have clearly shown you will go to any lengths for the benefit of us, and we just thank you for that. And let that, please seal this message in our hearts. Let that permeate our thinking so that we don't take it lightly or forget it. We love you. In his name, amen.
Amen.